When you respond to academic task 1 prompts that include charts, graphs, and tables, you have to make decisions about what information is most important to report about. That can be a challenge. So we're going to look at some examples of these kinds of visuals and think about what it is you should pull out from them and report about in your essay that you write for these task 1 prompts. Okay, so let's take a close look at these. First of all, when you come to a prompt that includes charts, graphs, or a table, you want to ask yourself these questions first. What is the purpose? Okay, what is the purpose of this visual that I'm looking at? What is it trying to communicate? Okay, that information is going to be key, especially for your overview paragraph that you write, where you have to kind of summarize what's in this visual in general terms. So look for that. Find the purpose of the visual. Most of the time you can find that information in the title. There's going to be usually a title to the visual you're looking at, and possibly some of the labels that are there on the visual itself should indicate what the purpose is. Look to that first. Try to understand that right away as you're looking at a visual. You also want to note the units of measurement. Okay, are they using money as a category? Some kind of percentage of something? Is it weight? Is it distance? What is it? Okay, I know many students circle the units so that they keep them in mind and they don't forget about them as they're writing, because it can pull your score down if you report about the units represented in an incorrect way. Okay, so be careful about that. Look for time as well. Time is often a feature of these visuals, how things change or how things, increase or decrease or whatever it is they're looking at over time. So note the time. Is it years? Is it minutes? What is it? And note that carefully so you report about those things accurately. Okay, now this isn't usually a very complicated part of the process, right? That information is usually provided for you very clearly on the visuals. You just want to make sure that that's your first step, that you look at it carefully. The more challenging thing is then to take a look at the visuals and try to make decisions about what is it that's most important for me to report about, okay? And that can be a bigger challenge, not only in your overview paragraph, but then making decisions about detailed information that you would want to write about. So what we're gonna look at in the remainder of this lesson is thinking about the key features, the most important information that you are likely to find on these visuals, and that you would want to pull out and discuss in your essay. And basically, we can identify these things as 4 different features of these visuals that you're likely to find. You're going to find that they show certain trends, milestones, changes, and contrasts. Okay, so we're going to look at some sample visuals that represent each of these 4 categories here, and just get some ideas about how to report about them. Now, I'm going to provide some sample sentences in this lesson, but if you look down below in the notes, you can see some more language there that's going to be useful for you to describe each of these 4 features. Okay, so look down below in the notes for some more language you can study and utilize as you're describing each of these things. Okay, let's start with this first visual that we have here. Now we're looking at, in general, our basic information. We're looking at Brainberry Island carbon emissions, and the time represented here is 1990 to 2005. Okay, so there's where we get some of our basic key information. Down below, we've got the units. Okay, we've got carbon emissions, and we've got units from 0 to 3 there, and those represent metric tons. Okay, so here would be 2 metric ton level. Okay, and we've got the time, of course, across the bottom. Okay, so that was our key information, the first sort of basic stuff we look at when we come to the visual. Okay, now as we look at this visual, we want to think about what is the key information we would want to pull out and describe in our essay for this particular visual. Well, this visual is a nice example of our first category, which is trends. Okay, this one shows a trend. The trend it shows is a rising trend over time. Okay, a trend is basically just the general direction something is moving. Okay, so in general, we can say that from 1990 to 2005, carbon emissions had an increasing trend. Okay, it was rising over that period. Now, there were some exceptions, right? We've got some declines here in 3 spots, okay? So that would also be part of the overall trend that we notice and that we would want to describe in our report about this particular visual, okay? So some sample language here we would use for this particular one. You know, the chart shows a steady rise in carbon emissions during this time period, or, overall carbon emissions increased at a constant rate, okay, so it was increasing regularly as a general trend over this period, and only 3 years saw a minor decline. Okay, this would be the kind of information you would want to report about. Of course, then as you get into the details of the minor declines, you could discuss the years and sort of give a general sense of how much things decreased during this time period. You could also describe in depth, the general trend of, particular years where the increase was more than others, or where it was flatter or less distinct than other years. Okay, you would get into the details as you describe this, but the key part of this visual is simply to notice that this trend has been occurring steadily since 1990 and on through 2005, at least in this chart. Okay, so this is a good example of how a trend can be the key information you would want to report about and provide details about then in your sort of paragraphs 2 and 3 and possibly 4 as you describe the details related to this information. Okay, so that's our first category, trends. Now, we see some trends in this one as well, okay? Here we've got sea lion and harbor seal populations in the Pacific Northwest, okay? And the time period here is 1995 to 2015. We've got their population numbers over here on the left side, and we've got the time represented at the bottom. So we do have some trends here. In general, I would say, we've got a general pattern of this falling and rising. So we could report about that as the key information, and that would be perfectly fine to report about that trend that you notice here. In addition to that, or as a different way of approaching this particular visual, we could talk about the milestones. The milestones you notice. The milestones are the peaks, the highest points, the lowest points, the instances where something reached the maximum or the minimum is usually going to be a kind of milestone. So we have a few milestones that we could note on this particular visual. We've got one over here, one over here. Those are the highest points of these populations over time. And we've got the milestones, the sort of low points that are down in particular here. Those could also be key things to report about as the important information from this visual. Okay, so a milestone, the sort of extremes of the visual that you're seeing, will sometimes be the information you want to pull out and report about for your essay. Okay, so some sample language here. Harbor seal and sea lion populations peaked in 1995 and 2015. Okay, so the peak is the highest point, right? We could also report about how the sea lion population in particular hit its lowest point around 2001. Okay, this again, these peaks and valleys or low points are significant information that you should pull out and report about on many of the visuals you see. Okay, so second category here, milestones. Again, look down below. You can see some more language to help you report about the milestones you see in your visuals you're looking at. Okay, a third category here, we can report about significant changes that we notice. Changes represented in the visuals. Here we've got a table. We've got average seasonal rainfall in Bernard County over each decade from 1950 to 2010. So we've got some units of time there. We've got these seasons reported down below, and we've got the decades we're looking at here. Our units are inches of rainfall. Okay, so we have to take a look. You might have to study this for a minute to look at what changes occurred. Were there general patterns that were significantly altered at some point? Well, if you look for a while, you'll notice that yes, there were. We can notice a change here, and in particular here as well. Okay, so the general trends that we saw before 1980 was that in the summer, the rainfall was pretty steady, around 1.8, 1.9, 1.7 inches. Okay, there wasn't much change for this time period. Suddenly, though, something occurred in the decade of 1980 to 90 where summer rainfall has started to go into decline. It started a new trend. So we can report about the trend. We should describe that in some way, but we could note as a key part of this table the change that occurred, okay, during this time. And we could categorize some of these changes. There's a similar change for the fall season, which is that in 1990, rainfall numbers also began to decline significantly, such that by 2000 to 2010, the number was quite a bit lower than it had been, up around 3.5, 3.9 inches. We're all the way down to 2.5 inches in that decade. So overall, the change was that summer and fall rainfall significantly declined, and those changes began around 1980, 1990 range. Okay. In the winter, the rainfall actually increased, okay, and that change began possibly here, I guess. We could say it started here as well, okay, so the 1980s, we started getting a little more rainfall, and that increased dramatically, so that by 2000 to 2010, we were getting much more rain. So that trend started going upward. The change occurred in 1980 to 90. Okay, so we would want to report the change that was noted. Now, we don't know why this is happening. There's no information to explain the change. We just need to describe the change in some way. So one way to report about this, a sample sentence below, just about summer rainfall. Summer rainfall totals were in decline beginning in the 1980s and had diminished significantly by the decade of 2000 to 2010. Okay, noting the significant change that began in the 1980s for summer rainfall. We could create similar sentences for fall, and then an opposite report about winter where the change occurred in the 1980s for an increasing amount of rainfall in that period. All right, so note the changes. What changes occurred? That will be information to pull out and report about on the visuals you see. That's the key information. Okay, a final category here, we've got contrasts. Many of your Task 1 visuals will show some kind of contrast, which is where you see two things beside each other that are very different in some way, okay, and strikingly different, okay, so that difference is something that will often be a feature to report about. We've got a very simple visual down below. This one would be accompanied by a table of some kind or a second visual. They like to do that on your Task 1 questions. But this one does show a nice contrast that you would certainly want to pull out and report about. And that is that the saltwater and freshwater percentages are so different, right? There's a huge contrast between the amount of the globe that is filled with salt water and the amount of fresh water that we have. Okay, so we could report about that information as a key feature. Most of the globe is covered by water, but only a very small percentage of that is fresh water. Okay, so that contrast is something to note, and you will often find these kinds of contrasts on your Task 1 visuals. Again, to report about contrasting information, look down below. There's lots of information for you down there, lots of sample sentences and vocabulary for you to point out contrasting features of your Task 1 visuals. Okay, so to review, when you come to a Task 1 prompt that has charts, graphs, tables, you ask just the basic information first. You try to determine what's the purpose of the visual, what are the units of measurement I'm looking at, and how is time represented on the visual, if at all. Usually there's some kind of time component on many of your Task 1 visuals. Okay, so you need to note that. Again, I think it's a good strategy to circle, especially the units of measurement that you're looking at on your visual. But then you want to look at your visuals and try to make determinations about what are the key features you want to pull out and report about from them. And in general, we can say that the key information, the stuff that's going to be most important to report about, are going to belong to one of the 4 categories we looked at. You're going to try to identify trends. Okay, so how patterns of things are either rising or declining or staying steady over time. Those are trends usually over time that you want to find. Milestones are the peaks or the low points, okay? The highest, the worst, whatever it is that you're looking at, whatever category it is, noting the places where it reached its highest or its lowest point is often something to pull out and describe in your Task 1 essays. You want to find changes. What are the points when something was going one way but then took a different direction? That will be a key feature to pull out. And the last one, contrasts. When you put 2 things or more beside one another, when one thing is so much bigger or smaller than the other things that you're comparing it against, that's a contrast. That is key information that you will want to pull out from the visuals you're looking at. Okay, so hopefully this will help you to make decisions about what information you should pull out from your Task 1 prompts that include graphs, charts, or tables.